Every morning, the same dog showed up at her cafe. No barking, no begging. Just sitting quietly by the door, watching. At first, she thought he was just another stray. One of the many that wandered through the streets looking for scraps and a little kindness, so she fed him. And he kept coming back, day after day, until one morning, as he turned to leave, something caught her eye. A small, worn-out bag hanging from his neck. She had seen him dozens of times, but she had never noticed that before, and when she finally opened it, everything changed. Clara Bennett had not chosen the quiet life so much as it had chosen her. She was 34 years old, the owner of a small cafe on the corner of Wren Street. A narrow lane that most people walked through without stopping. The cafe was called the Morning Cup, and it had been open for 6 years. Long enough for the paint on the window trim to start peeling. Long enough for the floorboards near the entrance to develop a familiar creak. Long enough for Clara to know every regular customer by name, by order, and by the particular way they took their coffee. She lived alone in the apartment above the cafe. She woke at 5:15 every morning, not because an alarm told her to, but because her body had simply learned the rhythm. By 5:30, she was downstairs. By 6, the espresso machine was warm. By 6:30, the first customers arrived, and the cafe filled with the low hum of early morning voices and the smell of roasted beans and something sweet baking in the oven behind the counter. It was a good life, a calm life. But if Clara were being honest with herself, and she tried not to be, most days, it was also a very lonely one. She had friends, of course. There was Diane, who ran the bookshop 2 doors down and came in every Tuesday and Thursday for a flat white and a long conversation. There was Marcus, the retired postman who sat by the window every morning from 7 to 8 and read the newspaper in silence. There was the young couple who always ordered the same thing: 2 oat lattes, 1 blueberry scone, and sat across from each other without talking, which Clara had always found oddly romantic. But at the end of every day, when the last customer left, and she turned the sign from OPN to Silacidi, and sat down with her own cup of tea, the cafe felt very large and very quiet. She had grown used to that feeling. She had not grown comfortable with it. It was on a Tuesday in early October when she first saw the dog. The morning had been overcast, the sky the color of old pewter, and Clara had been sweeping the front step when she noticed him. He was sitting on the pavement just beyond the small iron gate that marked the edge of the cafe's outdoor seating area. A medium-sized dog, brown and white, with ears that flopped slightly at the tips and eyes the color of dark amber. He was not thin in the way that strays often were, not visibly wounded, not trembling. He simply sat, still and watchful, like a figure in a painting. Clara stopped sweeping. The dog looked at her. She looked at the dog. He did not approach. He did not wag his tail. He did not make a sound. "Hello," she said, because it seemed like the right thing to say. He tilted his head slightly, just a fraction, and held her gaze. She swept for another minute, watching him from the corner of her eye. He did not move. When she went back inside to open the cafe, she glanced through the glass door. He was still there. When the first customer arrived at 6:30, Marcus, with his folded newspaper. She watched the dog carefully to see what he would do. He shifted slightly on the pavement, let Marcus pass without any fuss, and then resumed his quiet observation of the cafe's entrance. By 8 o'clock, when the morning rush had passed, and Clara stood by the window with her coffee, the dog was gone. She had not seen him leave. She thought stray, probably. Looking for food, maybe. Or warmth. The mornings were getting cold. She did not think about him again until the following morning, when she opened the front door at 5:30. And found him sitting in exactly the same spot. By the end of the first week, Clara had accepted that the dog was going to keep coming back. He arrived every morning between 6 and 6:15. She began to notice the precision of it. The way he appeared like clockwork, always before the first customers, always after she had unlocked the door. He sat in the same place just outside the gate, at the edge of the outdoor seating area, facing the entrance. He did not bark. He did not pace. He simply sat and watched. On the third morning, she brought him a bowl of water and a leftover piece of plain bread from the previous day's baking. He ate the bread carefully, drank a little water, and then sat back down. On the fourth morning, she brought him a small bowl of boiled chicken, which she had made specifically for him. A fact she tried not to examine too closely, because it meant she had thought about him the night before. He ate the chicken. He drank more water. He sat back down. He never came inside the gate. He never pushed past the threshold. He seemed to understand exactly where his territory ended and hers began, and he respected that boundary with a kind of dignity that Clara found privately more impressive than most people she knew. What struck her most, though, was that he never begged. She had fed strays before. A tabby cat that used to lurk near the back door. A thin terrier mix that had shown up one Christmas Eve. And they had always wanted more. They had always pressed closer, always watched the door with hungry urgency. Always communicated a kind of desperate neediness that, while understandable, was also exhausting. This dog was different. He accepted what she offered, and then he waited. And when, sometime around 8 or 8:30, he decided the morning was over, he simply stood up, turned, and walked away down Wren Street toward the junction with Aldgate Lane, disappearing around the corner at a calm, unhurried pace. Every single morning, same time, same place, same quiet departure. Clara mentioned him to Diane on the following Tuesday. Sounds like he's found himself a routine, Diane said, wrapping her hands around her flat white. It's the routine that bothers me, Clara said. It's too precise. Like he's, I don't know, like he has somewhere to be. Diane smiled. You're anthropomorphizing a stray dog. Maybe, Clara said, but she did not stop thinking about him. By the third week, the dog had become a kind of fixture at the morning cup, in the same unobtrusive way that the hanging fern above the window or the old clock above the counter were fixtures. Present, familiar, occasionally glanced at, never fully explained. Clara had started talking to him. Not long conversations, just small ones, the kind she might have with herself while performing a task. She would bring out his bowl in the morning and say something like, "Chilly today, isn't it?" Or, "You look well." And he would look at her with those amber eyes in a way that made her feel, absurdly, that he was listening carefully and choosing not to respond only because speech was beneath him. His eyes were remarkable. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Most dogs, in her experience, communicated enthusiasm or anxiety or need through their whole body. The tail, the posture, the tilt of the head. This dog communicated almost entirely through his eyes. They were calm and observant and faintly serious, the eyes of something that had seen a great deal and formed its own quiet conclusions. She named him, eventually. She had tried not to, knowing that naming meant caring and caring meant loss, and she had experienced enough of that particular sequence to be cautious. But by the fourth week, when she found herself referring to him in her mind as the dog, she realized the namelessness had become its own kind of attachment, and she might as well surrender to the inevitable. She called him Percy. It suited him somehow. A little formal, a little old-fashioned, carrying the faint suggestion of dignity. The customers began to notice Percy too. As the weeks went on, Marcus, the retired postman, commented one morning that the brown and white dog had been out front again. The young couple began leaving pieces of their blueberry scone near the gate when they left. A woman named Helen, who came in every Wednesday for a pot of Earl Grey and always sat alone near the back, started arriving a few minutes early so she could watch Percy from the window. "He's good for business," Diane said one afternoon, half joking. "He's not mine," Clara said automatically. Diane looked at her over the rim of her cup. "You feed him every day, you've given him a name, and you look for him before you've even started the coffee machine. He's yours, Clara. He just doesn't live here yet." Clara said nothing, but she did not disagree. It was in the fifth week that she began to notice the smaller things. Percy always came from the same direction, not down Wren Street from the north, where most of the pedestrian traffic flowed, but from the south, from the narrow end of the lane, that opened onto Aldgate Lane, and then, beyond that, into the older part of the neighborhood where the streets narrowed and the buildings were mostly residential, a mix of converted Victorian terraces and low-rise council housing. He always left in the same direction too, back the way he had come, at the same unhurried pace, somewhere between 8 and 8:30. She had never seen anyone with him. No owner calling after him. No lead trailing behind him. No tags that she could make out at that distance. On a Wednesday in the 6th week, it rained. Not a light drizzle. A proper autumn downpour, the kind that arrived without much warning and soaked everything within minutes. Clara had set up a small overhang near the outdoor seating area that morning, anticipating it, and she was behind the counter watching the rain hammer the pavement. When Percy appeared at his usual time, drenched but unhurried, and took his place just outside the gate, he sat in the rain. Clara watched him for a moment, then went to the back of the café and retrieved an old towel she kept for mopping up spills. She came outside with her coat half on and dried him as best she could. He submitted to this with patience and something that might, generously, have been gratitude. "You're ridiculous," she told him, crouching in the rain. "You don't have to come every day, you know." Percy looked at her. She had the strange and vivid impression that he understood what she had said, and that he disagreed. It was when she straightened up and Percy turned to go inside the gate. She had guided him under the overhang, out of the worst of the rain, that she saw it for the first time. Just a glimpse, a flash of something dark against his wet fur around his neck. She had assumed it was his coat, or the shadow of his collar, if he had one. But something made her look again. There was something there. Something small, tied close to his neck with a cord. She reached out, but Percy had already shifted away, stepping back toward the gate with a gentle finality, the way he always did when the morning was ending. By the time she had straightened her coat and looked again, he was already at the corner of Aldgate Lane, turning south, disappearing from view. She stood in the rain for a moment longer. Then she went inside and thought about what she had seen for the rest of the day. The following morning was clear, the kind of October morning that arrived washed clean by the previous day's rain, the air sharp and bright, the low sun casting long shadows down Wren Street and catching the drops that still clung to the cafe's window frame. Clara was outside before Percy arrived, wiping down the outdoor table, positioning herself casually near the gate with a clear line of sight to the south end of the lane. Percy appeared at 6:11. He walked toward her at his usual pace, settled into his usual spot, and looked up at her with his usual expression of patient, undemanding attention. And in the clear morning light, with the low sun falling directly across him, Clara saw it properly for the first time, around his neck, tucked close against his fur and looped through his collar, which she now saw was a plain brown leather collar, old but well made, was a small bag. It was roughly the size of a coin purse, made of dark canvas that had been worn soft with age and weather. The cord that held it was a thin piece of leather, tied in a knot that looked deliberate and careful. The bag sat flat against his chest, between his front legs, visible only from the front and only in good light. She had looked at this dog every morning for more than 5 weeks. She had never seen it. Clara crouched down slowly. Percy watched her. He did not back away. She reached out her hand, the way you approach any animal, slowly, palm up, giving him every opportunity to retreat. He sniffed her hand. She moved her fingers toward the bag. He stayed still. She touched the edge of the canvas. It was damp from yesterday's rain but otherwise intact. She could feel that there was something inside. Something small and light. Not a coin or a key. Something that shifted slightly when she tilted it. She pulled her hand back. She looked at Percy. He looked at her. "What is this?" she asked quietly. He blinked once. She sat back on her heels in the cold morning air and thought about what it meant. Dog had been showing up at her cafe every day for 5 weeks with a small bag tied around his neck, and she had only just noticed. She thought about the deliberateness of it. The knotted cord, the flat, careful placement. Someone had put that bag there. Someone who knew what they were doing, someone who had tied it with the intention of keeping it secure, of keeping it from being lost. Someone had sent Percy out into the world wearing that bag. She stood up. "I'm going to open it," she told him, as though asking permission. He sat quietly. "All right," she said, and reached for it again. Getting the bag free from the cord took several minutes of careful work. Crouching in the cold, while Percy held himself with extraordinary stillness, as though he understood exactly what was needed from him. The knot was tight but not impossible. Clara's fingers were cold and slightly clumsy, and she worked at it gently, not wanting to pull at his neck. Eventually, the cord loosened, and she cupped the bag in both hands. It was lighter than she expected. She looked at Percy again. He had not moved, not once, during the entire process. "Thank you," she said, which felt both inadequate and exactly right. She carried the bag inside the café, set it on the counter near the window, where the morning light was strongest, and stared at it for a long moment before opening it. The top of the bag folded over and was held shut by a small metal clasp. The kind found on old coin purses, two curved pieces of metal that pressed together. Clara pressed the sides, and the clasp released with a soft click. She turned the bag upside down and held her hand beneath it. Two things fell out. The first was a small photograph, black and white, roughly the size of a playing card, creased and soft at the edges from being handled many times. It showed a man, older, perhaps in his late 70s, slight and white-haired, sitting in a garden chair outside a brick house. He was smiling directly at the camera. On his lap, looking up at him with enormous contentment, was a brown and white dog. Percy. There was no question. The ears, the markings, the particular set of the animal's expression. Clara turned the photograph over with fingers that were no longer entirely steady. On the back, in a handwriting that was careful, but clearly effortful, someone had written, "His name is Pepper. He is gentle and he is good. Please, if you are reading this, he needs help finding his way home. He knows the way, but he cannot go alone anymore. I am at number 40, 1 Aldgate Lane. My name is Arthur. I am not well." Clara read it 3 times. Then, she set the photograph down and picked up the second item that had fallen from the bag. It was a folded piece of paper, smaller than the photograph, the fold soft and worn, as though it had been opened and refolded many times. She opened it. Inside, in the same careful handwriting, was a single line, "If he has come to you, then I have run out of time. Please don't let him wait alone." Clara stood very still in the quiet café, with the morning light falling across the counter, and the espresso machine humming softly, and the sound of the street beginning outside, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not dramatically, not like a door being thrown open, but quietly, the way a window creaks open in a still room, and the air changes. She had thought Percy was coming to her for food. He had been coming to her for help. She told Marcus when he arrived at 7, because he was steady and practical, and she needed someone steady and practical beside her in that moment. She showed him the photograph, the 2 notes. Marcus read them slowly, looked at the photograph for a long time, and then set it down on the table. "Number 40, 1 Aldgate Lane," he said. "Yes. That's about a 10-minute walk from here." "Yes. Are you going to go?" Clara looked through the window at Percy, who had resumed his place just outside the gate, with the quiet patience of something that had waited for a very long time. "I'm going to follow him," she said. She asked Diane to watch the café for the morning. Diane, who had a key from the one occasion 2 years ago, when Clara had a dental appointment and needed someone to open up. Diane arrived within 15 minutes, took one look at the photograph and the notes, and waved Clara out the door with an expression that brooked no argument. Clara put Percy's bag back around his neck and retied the cord carefully. Then she stood up and said, "Percy, go home." She was not sure what she expected. For a moment, Percy simply looked at her, in that way of his, calm and considering. Then he stood up. He looked at her once more, just briefly, as though confirming something. And then he walked to the south end of Wren Street, turned the corner onto Aldgate Lane, and began to walk. Clara followed. The streets that morning were quiet in the way that residential streets are quiet after the school run. A lull between one kind of business and the next. The trees that lined Aldgate Lane were losing their leaves, and they drifted across the pavement in slow, unhurried spirals. Percy walked at a pace that was clearly meant to be followed. Not slow, but not fast. He moved along the center of the pavement, pausing at the curb of each intersection to look left and right. Actually looked, she noted, the way a careful pedestrian would. Before crossing, the neighborhood changed as she walked. Wren Street was all small commerce and foot traffic, but Aldgate Lane became residential quickly. The businesses giving way to terraced houses with small front gardens and wheelie bins near the gate. The houses were older here, some of them very old, with that particular exhausted dignity of buildings that had been through a great deal and were still standing. There were bay windows with net curtains. There were window boxes that had gone brown for the season. There was the smell of someone's chimney smoke, and the sound of a television through an open upstairs window. Clara walked and watched Percy, and she felt an emotion she could not immediately name. Something between grief and tenderness, the feeling of being let in on a secret that the whole world should have known already. He had been doing this alone. Every morning, he had made this walk, from wherever he had come from, to her café, and then back. Every morning, wearing that bag around his neck, hoping that someone would finally notice. She did not know how long he had been doing it. Before she arrived in his routine, she did not know how many people had seen the bag and not looked closely, or seen the bag and not cared, or simply never seen the bag at all. The way she had not seen it for 5 weeks. 41 mornings. She counted them as she walked. 41 times he had sat outside the gate. 41 times she had brought him food and water and asked him how he was, and 41 times the answer had been right there around his neck, and she had not seen it. Percy stopped in front of a low brick house with a green front door and a small garden that had been carefully tended. Was now showing the first signs of neglect. A low shrub that needed trimming. A garden path where the weeds had started to push through the cracks. The house number was mounted in brass beside the door. 41. Percy sat down and looked at Clara. She opened the gate. She knocked 3 times before she heard anything. Then, from inside, the sound of slow, careful movement. The sound of someone navigating a house with effort. The particular rhythm of a person who could no longer take their own mobility for granted. Clara waited. She did not knock again. The door opened. The man in the photograph was smaller in person, or perhaps he had become smaller since the picture was taken. He stood in the doorway in a cardigan and soft trousers, leaning on a wooden walking stick, and he was looking at Percy with an expression that Clara would think about for a very long time afterward. Something raw and relieved and quietly broken. The expression of someone who had been waiting for a long time and was only now beginning to believe the waiting was over. "Pepper," he said. Just that. Percy. Pepper. Made a sound Clara had never heard him make before. A low, soft sound, more breath than bark, and he pressed himself gently against Arthur's leg, not jumping, not overwhelming him, just leaning. The way dogs do when they want to be close to someone and they understand that they have to be careful. Arthur looked up at Clara. "You found the bag," he said. "He found me," she said. "He's been coming to my cafe every morning for about 6 weeks. I only noticed the bag yesterday." Arthur was quiet for a moment. He looked down at Pepper and then back at Clara, and something in his expression shifted. A kind of exhausted, reluctant acceptance. The look of a person who has been proven right about something and takes no pleasure in it. "Come inside," he said. "I'll tell you." Arthur Calloway was 78 years old and had lived alone at number 41 Aldgate Lane for the past 3 years, since his wife Margaret had died. He had a daughter in Edinburgh who called twice a week and had wanted him to move north. But Arthur had lived on that street for 39 years, and the idea of leaving it struck him as a kind of defeat he was not ready for. He had his doctor, he had his neighbor Mrs. Okafor who checked on him on Fridays, and he had Pepper. He had adopted Pepper from a rescue center 4 years ago, a year before Margaret died. He had not expected to love an animal so thoroughly at that age. But Pepper had that effect on people, Arthur said. He looked at you and you felt, somehow, that you had been recognized. 8 weeks ago, Arthur had fallen, not dramatically. He had simply misjudged the bottom step of his staircase in the evening, and gone down hard on his hip and his shoulder. He had lain on the floor for nearly 2 hours before he managed to get himself to his phone and call for help. He had spent 5 days in hospital, and the doctors had told him, in the careful way that doctors have of telling you things, without quite telling you everything, that he needed to be more careful, that he needed support, that the fall had done more or damage than would be immediately obvious, and that recovery would be slow. He had come home to Pepper, and in the weeks that followed, as the pain continued and his mobility decreased, and the house became increasingly difficult to manage, he had begun to understand that he was in trouble. He could not walk to the shops. He could not cook properly. He could not manage the stairs reliably. His daughter was coming at Christmas, which was 6 weeks away, but 6 weeks. As Arthur told Clara, sitting in the low armchair by his front window with Pepper pressed against his ankle, was a very long time when you were not managing well. He had thought about putting a note on Pepper's collar for weeks before he did it. The idea had come to him in the middle of the night, the way ideas do when sleep won't come, and the mind ranges over its options. Pepper was healthy and mobile, and he walked a known route. Arthur used to take him to a café near the end of Wren Street years ago. Before his hip had made long walks difficult, Pepper knew the area. Pepper was reliable. Arthur had tied the bag around Pepper's neck on a Monday morning, had opened the back gate, and had watched Pepper walk away. I didn't know if it would work, Arthur said. He was looking at his hands. I didn't know if anyone would pay attention. I thought, well, he'll come back, and either someone will have read it, or they won't, and if they don't, I'll think of something else. Clara looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece. A large version of the same image that had been in the bag. Arthur and Pepper in the garden, both of them unguarded in their happiness. How long had he been doing it before I noticed the bag? She asked. Arthur was quiet for a moment. 6 weeks, he said. You were the third café he tried. He went to the first 2, but I suppose no one paid enough attention. He kept adjusting his route until he found someone who would feed him. A faint, effortful smile. He's a smart animal. 6 weeks. Clara thought about Percy. Pepper. Sitting outside her gate for 6 weeks, carrying that note in that bag, waiting for someone to look closely enough. She thought about the rain, and the way he had sat in it without complaint. She thought about how she had assumed he was a stray, had fed him and talked to him and grown fond of him. And all the while he had been something else entirely. Not an abandoned dog, but a devoted one, not lost. Working. He needs someone, Arthur said. I need someone. I don't want to be dramatic about it, but I'm not managing, and I don't want Pepper to be alone in this house with me if something happens that I can't handle on my own. It won't, Clara said, not anymore. She called Arthur's daughter that afternoon. Sarah Calloway answered on the second ring, and listened without interrupting while Clara explained who she was and what had happened. And when Clara finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that Clara checked the screen to see if the call had dropped. He tied a note to the dog, Sarah said finally. Yes. Another silence. That is the most my father thing I have ever heard. They arranged for Sarah to come down the following weekend. In the meantime, Clara organized what she could. She contacted a local care coordination service she knew through a customer, arranged for a daily visit from a support worker, called Mrs. Okafor and filled her in, and went to the supermarket on Aldgate Lane herself and stocked Arthur's kitchen with food that was easy to prepare. She visited every day that week. Arthur, who was a proud man and initially resistant to what he called a fuss, softened by the second visit. Perhaps because Clara did not treat him like someone to be managed but like someone worth knowing. She sat with him in the afternoons and they talked. About the neighborhood, about Margaret, about the cafe and how it had started. Pepper sat between them, and Clara found herself thinking, more than once, this was what the dog had wanted all along. Not just help for Arthur, but something like this, two people who might have walked past each other for years. Now sitting together in the low afternoon light, the tea growing cold, neither of them in any hurry to leave. On the fourth visit, Arthur said, "Would you take him? While I recover, properly take him. Not just visits, but have him with you." Clara looked at Pepper. Pepper looked at Clara. She thought about the apartment above the cafe, which was very quiet in the evenings. She thought about the mornings, and how they would be different with a dog in them. She thought about how she had told Diane, 6 weeks ago, "He's not mine." "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." The cafe changed after Pepper arrived, not dramatically. It was still the Morning Cup, still on the corner of Wren Street, still painted the same faded blue, gray that Clara had chosen 6 years ago, and never quite got around to repainting. The floorboards still creaked near the entrance. The clock above the counter still ran 3 minutes fast. But Pepper had a bed in the corner near the window, and the customers knew it, and they came in slightly differently now. There was an extra small ceremony to the morning. A pause near the door to greet him. A moment of warmth before the day proper began. Marcus brought him a dog biscuit every morning in his coat pocket. With the solemnity of a man performing a ritual, Helen, the woman who always sat alone near the back with her Earl Grey, began sitting near the window instead, where she could see Pepper's corner. Clara noticed, as the weeks went on, that she was less often alone at the end of the day than she had been before. It was partly Pepper. She could not sit with her tea in the quiet and feel the silence as absence, when there was a warm animal beside her, breathing slowly, occasionally sighing in the philosophical way of dogs who have had a full day. But it was also something else, something harder to name. The act of paying attention, really paying attention, the way she had learned to pay attention to the bag she had not seen for 41 mornings, had become a habit she could not easily put down. She looked at things more carefully now. She listened when customers talked. She noticed when someone was having a difficult morning before they said anything about it. She visited Arthur twice a week, and then once a week when Sarah arranged for more regular support. Sarah came down not just for 1 weekend, but for 2 weeks in November, working remotely from her father's spare room. And by the time she left, she had enrolled him in a day program 2 mornings a week, and arranged for handrails to be fitted on the staircase and the bath. Arthur grumbled about the handrails. He also used them every day without further comment. His health improved slowly, in the cautious way that health improves in the elderly when the crisis has passed and the support has arrived. He began walking again in late November. Short distances with his stick, accompanied by Clara and Pepper on the weekend visits. He was not the man in the garden chair photograph, not entirely, but he was himself, and that was enough. On a Saturday in December, when the first frost had come and the cafe windows were steamed from the inside, Arthur sat in the corner near the window, Pepper's corner, and had a cup of tea and watched the street. Clara sat with him. They did not talk very much. He chose well, Arthur said at one point, looking at Pepper, who was asleep in a patch of winter sun. "He's a smart animal," Clara said. Arthur smiled. "He always knew things before I did." Clara thought about that later, washing up after closing. She thought about all the things she had almost missed. The bag she hadn't noticed for 6 weeks, the dog she had mistaken for a stray, the man, at the end of Aldgate Lane, who had been there all along, waiting, doing the best he could with what he had. There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not look like loneliness from the outside. It looks, instead, like competence, like someone who has their morning routine, and their regular customers, and their quiet evenings, and seems from a sufficient distance, to be perfectly fine. It is the loneliness of people who function well, who do not make demands, who have simply learned to accommodate the space where other people might have been. Clara had not known that she was one of those people until a brown and white dog sat outside her gate one October morning and waited, with infinite patience, for her to pay attention. She was not sure she could account for why Percy, Pepper, had chosen her cafe. In the end, the practical answer was that he knew the route, that Arthur had once brought him there, that Clara had fed him on the first morning, and so he had come back. The practical answer was probably sufficient. But she had learned, by then, to be skeptical of the practical answer. The practical answer said, this is just a stray dog. The practical answer said, it is just a cord around his neck. Probably nothing. The practical answer said, someone else will notice. Someone else will help. And the practical answer, in her experience, was often the thing that stood between you and the truth of what was actually happening. She dried her hands. She looked through the kitchen hatch at Pepper, who had moved in his sleep, and was now pressed against the door in the particular way of dogs who want to remain close to the person they have attached themselves to. She had not rescued him. He had, in his quiet and methodical way, rescued her. The morning after the first heavy snow of winter, Clara came downstairs at 5:15 and found Pepper already awake, sitting by the front door with an expression that communicated, clearly and without ambiguity, that he would like to go outside. She put on her coat. She clipped on his lead. She opened the front door of the cafe. The snow had settled overnight, and Wren Street was silent under it. The parked cars pale shapes, the street lamps hallowed with cold light, the sky still dark overhead but beginning, at the edges, to lighten. The snow on the pavement was unbroken, unmarked. Pepper stepped out of the doorway and into it, looked left and looked right, and then turned and looked at Clara with his amber eyes. And she had the feeling she had learned to trust, the feeling that something was being communicated, that there was more here than met the eye. That paying attention was the whole and entire point. All right, she said. As she had said the morning, she opened the bag, and they walked out together into the white and quiet street, the dog's paws leaving small, clean prints in the snow, and Clara following behind him, warm in her coat, awake in the cold morning, paying attention. Some things we overlook for weeks, months, years, not because we do not care, but because we have learned, without realizing it, to stop looking closely. We feed the dog and assume we understand it. We walk the same street and assume we know it. We sit with our lives and assume we have accounted for them. But sometimes, in a patch of clear morning light, you see what has been there all along. A small bag on a dog's neck, a note in careful handwriting, a life, 2 lives, waiting, without complaint, for someone to finally pay attention. The world does not announce its quiet emergencies. It sends them to you slowly, patiently, in forms you might walk past 100 times before you see. Pay attention. Look closely. You never know what is waiting just outside the gate.